United States Navy Captain Daniel Gallery had already built a reputation for disrupting German U-boat operations across the Atlantic. But, by the summer of 1944, he was preparing for the boldest move of his career and operation no one had dared attempt in over a century, and live to talk about, as their latest prey, U-505, broke the surface following a devastating depth charge assault. Water poured from its hull, and smoke rose from its battered frame. Despite the damage, the submarine was quickly targeted by a relentless barrage from American destroyers and aircraft. Desperate to escape, the German crew abandoned ship, diving into the Atlantic as gunfire rained down around them. For the Americans, the mission was clear. A specially selected boarding team was about to risk toxic fumes, flooding, and the threat of scuttling charges and booby traps to enter the heart of an enemy submarine, something no American had ever done before. In December 1943, the German U-boat U-505 was without a captain, its crew demoralized and its luck seemingly run out. Among hundreds of Kriegsmarine submarines, it had become notorious for its misfortunes. It hadn't always been this way. On its first patrol a year earlier, the Type IXE submarine had successfully sunk a 7,200-ton British freighter, a strong debut that quickly gave way to repeated failures. Missed torpedo shots, harrowing depth charge attacks, and mounting damage from enemy aircraft and warships plagued every mission. Time and again, U-505 limped back to port, spending months in repairs. The low point came in October 1943 when an Allied warship depth-charged U-505 near the Caribbean. Amid the chaos, with explosions rocking the vessel and crew morale shattered, the ship's commander, Captain Peter Jeck, took his own life during the attack. What followed was a decisive moment. High Command aimed to reverse the submarine's fate and appointed 40-year-old Oberleutnant Harold Langer as the new skipper. Leadership hoped his age and calm presence would stabilize the shaken crew. Lang's first significant mission didn't begin until March 16, 1944. When U-505 set out to patrol the waters off the western coast of Africa in search of Allied shipping. For days, she cruised near Ségou, past Sierra Leone, and into the Gulf of Guinea. The crew remained alert, scanning for targets. Langer, no stranger to U-boat tactics, knew that submarines, like U-505, were fastest on the surface, often outrunning convoys at over 20 knots. They remained submerged by day and surfaced at night to reposition for the kill. Conservative commanders attacked from a distance, stalking convoys beyond the horizon. But the boldest among them would penetrate the convoy itself, fire torpedoes from bow and stern, and vanish in the ensuing chaos. Langer was ready to take that risk. Yet despite weeks at sea, U-505 encountered no targets. One crewman remarked that the submarine still seemed cursed. In truth, it wasn't misfortune this time. Allied naval intelligence had intercepted U-505's radio communications and rerouted all nearby shipping to ensure the submarine returned to base without results. By the end of May, Langer chose to head back to Lorient, a U-boat base on France's western coast. Low on fuel and morale, the crew had accomplished nothing in over 2 months. Unbeknownst to them, Allied codebreakers were tracking their every move. They knew U-505's likely destination and route. This intelligence reached Captain Daniel Gallery, who now had a unique opportunity. U-505 was heading straight toward his grasp. Task Group 22.3 set out from Norfolk, Virginia, on May 15, 1944. This hunter-killer team was led by the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal, part of the Casablanca class, and included 5 destroyer escorts: USS Chatelaine, USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Florida, and USS Jenks. Their mission was to hunt and engage enemy submarines in the Atlantic. At the head of this force was Captain Daniel Gallery, a Chicago-born former aviator. Commanding a baby carrier like Guadalcanal wasn't the Navy's most prestigious assignment. Smaller than fleet carriers, these ships were often considered second-rate. Gallery knew this perception and how hard it would be to distinguish himself in such a role, but determined to make the most of his opportunity to lead in combat. The 42-year-old commander committed himself fully to the task. By mid-1944, Gallery's task group left the Canary Islands for Cape Verde, armed with valuable intelligence from intercepted German communications, although the Allies hadn't yet cracked the full details of U-boat locations encrypted with a newer Enigma device. They had enough to identify key operational zones, combined with HFDF, or HFDF, a direction-finding system that could triangulate EU boat radio signals. Task Group 22.3 was able to patrol strategically rather than blindly. Submarines needed to transmit radio messages to report positions, request supplies, and pass along convoy sightings, but these messages were also a vulnerability. Task Group 22.3 would spread out in targeted shipping lanes to intercept transmissions. With 2 ships triangulating a signal, they could pinpoint a submarine's location. Equipped with depth charges, hedgehog mortar, advanced sonar, and abundant ammunition, the group had turned intelligence into action. In early April, after hours of relentless pursuit and depth charge attacks, the task group had a breakthrough moment with U-515... The submarine was forced to surface, leaving its crew with no option but to abandon ship. Gallery's escorts moved quickly to rescue the German sailors as their damaged U-boat began its slow descent into the sea. Watching the scene unfold, Gallery had a moment of clarity. He later reflected that perhaps, if they hadn't been so determined to sink the submarine, they could have captured it instead. With the right training and preparation, he realized, it might be possible to board a U-boat, stop the crew from scuttling it, and seize it as a living war prize. At the time, Gallery didn't know that the US Navy hadn't captured an enemy vessel on the high seas in over 130 years. Not since the War of 1812, when Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry had taken several British ships during the Battle of Lake Erie. Earlier in World War II, only 2 attempts had been successful, both involving scuttled German U-boats and leading to the recovery of valuable Enigma machines. Gallery knew that capturing a fully intact German submarine, complete with the latest Enigma equipment, could be his opportunity to demonstrate the value of escort carriers and the power of daring. Leadership. Less than 12 hours after this realization, Task Group 22.3 encountered U-68 near Cape Verde and launched a coordinated attack that destroyed the submarine with aerial bombs. After the victory, Gallery shared his bold new strategy with his men. If a U-boat surfaced, rather than sinking it outright, the destroyer escorts would neutralize its deck guns using .50 caliber machine guns and, as Gallery put it, encourage the crew to get off the boat. Once abandoned, a specially trained boarding party would storm the U-boat, disable any traps, close scuttling valves, and stabilize the vessel to keep it afloat, ultimately towing it back to American shores. As Gallery laid out his plan, skepticism was evident among the destroyer escort captains. Regardless, he pressed on, forming and training a boarding team within his task group. Drawing on intelligence from captured German sailors, he drilled his men relentlessly. Soon, they would find the perfect target. Gallery could feel it coming. For the remainder of the spring, Captain Gallery mentally rehearsed the operation. It still seemed nearly impossible, but he remained determined. Task Group 22.3 continued to patrol the waters off the west coast of Africa, scanning the Atlantic for elusive German submarines. By early summer, they had yet to engage another enemy. German U-boats were out there, but with their fuel reserves running low. The task group had no choice but to begin the journey back to Casablanca to refuel. Then, on June 4, 1944, fortune smiled on them. As the USS Guadalcanal and its escorts began their return voyage, a fighter plane was launched for reconnaissance. The waters of the Rio de Oro glistened beneath the sun as the FM-2 Wildcat swept across the area. The pilot's sharp eyes caught sight of a silhouette moving beneath the surface. It was U-505, the German submarine. Exhausted from a long and fruitless patrol, had unknowingly drifted into the hunting grounds of Task Group 22.3. Asterisk, the pilot immediately relayed the coordinates and maintained visual contact. Captain Gallery acted without hesitation. He ordered the destroyer escorts to close in. As the group surged toward the target, the sun glinted off U-505's hull in the Atlantic blue. Realizing the danger, Oberleutnant Harold Lunger, commanding the submarine, gave the order to fire a torpedo before the enemy could get any closer. The weapons streaked through the water, aimed at USS Guadalcanal, but the destroyer escorts maneuvered frantically, narrowly avoiding disaster as the torpedo passed beneath USS Chatelaine. Asterisk, the Germans had made it clear they would not surrender easily. Taking advantage of the moment, Chatelaine advanced aggressively on U-505, at such close range. Standard depth charges were ineffective. They couldn't reach the submarine fast enough. Instead, the crew fired a volley of Mark V Hedgehog mortar, small contact explosives intended to disable rather than destroy, fitting perfectly with the mission's objective. Asterisk above, the Wildcat circled, its pilot watching closely and firing into the water to mark the submarine's location. With aerial support guiding them, Chatelaine released a pattern of depth charges. A series of underwater explosions followed, clouding the sea in a blinding froth. Then a dark stain began to spread across the surface. Over the radio, the fighter pilot confirmed what the crew had hoped for. Oil was rising to the top. Chaos had erupted below the waves. Inside the U-boat, the Germans experienced a torrent of destruction. Their attempts to evade USS strikes were futile. Sailors were knocked off their feet as the hull absorbed each shockwave. The submarine's ill-fated streak had returned with vengeance. Asterisk crew members struggled to hold on as violent tremors rocked the vessel. In the confined steel passageways, they fought to maintain control. Any thought of counterattack had vanished. Now, it was a battle to survive. Each thunderous impact diminished their hope further. Asterisk in the control room, systems failed one after another. Salt water gushed through broken seams, flooding compartments, and short-circuiting vital equipment. The rudder was jammed, leaving the U-boat circling helplessly a sitting target. In the engine room, sailors stood frozen as a crack split the pressure hull. Oil and debris spilled from the submarine, betraying its position to the Americans. Above asterisk seeing there was no way to fight or flee, Captain Langer made a grim but necessary decision. He ordered the submarine to surface and be abandoned to save the lives of his crew. His men scrambled to carry out scuttling procedures, hoping to keep the Americans from claiming the prize they were after. Asterisk, as U-505 broke the surface, American destroyer escorts and aircraft opened fire with 20 and 40 mm rounds on the exposed deck. The German crew rushed into position to abandon ship, leaping into the ocean one by one, dodging bullets and ricochets. Some hesitated, others were hit and fell before being swept overboard by the chaos. Asterisk Langer himself was struck in the legs, the force of the impact knocking him back into the hatch before he managed to drag himself out and into the sea. Wounded sailors clung to floating debris in the oil-streaked sea, struggling to stay afloat. For a brief moment, they believed the Americans would continue their attack, wiping out the entire crew of U-505, but to their surprise, the destroyer escorts began pulling the Germans from the water. 59 sailors were rescued soaked, injured, and utterly defeated. They were disarmed and became prisoners of war. Many hesitated before stepping aboard enemy ships, but it was a better fate than drowning in the Atlantic. Asterisk as they sat on the deck of USS Chatelaine, the captured crew turned and saw, to their horror, that U-505 was still afloat. In their haste to escape, they had failed to activate the scuttling charges meant to destroy the submarine. The path was now clear for the Americans to claim the vessel. The German prisoners could only watch helplessly as preparations were made to board the damaged submarine. Gallery's moment had arrived. What had seemed impossible for most of the war was now within reach. Asterisk, the captain turned to his crew and simply said he wanted to capture the submarine if possible. The operation he had spent months envisioning and rehearsing was about to be put into action. USS Pillsbury was chosen to deploy the boarding party. The sailors had spent countless hours studying the blueprints of German submarines, memorizing every hatch, valve, and component needed to keep a captured U-boat afloat. Lieutenant Albert L. David led the boarding team. Outfitted in combat gear and ready for what could be a lethal mission, they knew the risk scuttling charges could still sink the submarine at any moment, and booby traps could be hidden anywhere. But the rewards were too great to ignore. Inside U-505 could be intelligence that might alter the course of the war, codebooks, navigation charts, and, most valuable of all, an Enigma machine. The crew launched a small craft into the rough waters, steering it toward the wounded U-boat. As they approached, they saw the conning tower and forward deck angled steeply, steam hissing from within. The erratic movements of U-505 made the approach even more dangerous, with waves threatening to capsize the boarding craft. The sailors gripped the edges tightly as they came alongside. Lieutenant David was the first to climb onto the slick, oil-covered deck. One by one, his men followed, planting their boots firmly to avoid slipping. Inside the submarine, the boarding party entered a chaotic scene. The Germans had fled just moments earlier, leaving behind a wrecked and flooding vessel. The depth charge attacks had left the submarine heavily damaged, and seawater was pouring in. The Germans had managed to open several key valves before abandoning ship, and the Americans had only moments to act. The team moved quickly, capping an open sea strainer to stem the flooding. Their efforts bought time, but the submarine's condition remained critical. The diesel engines were still running, vibrating dangerously and stressing the compromised hull. Relying on their knowledge of German submarine design, the team disconnected the engines from the propellers to reduce strain. Meanwhile, back aboard the American ships, sailors searched through the prisoners for anyone who could assist. Identified a Polish sailor among the German crew and persuaded him to help, possibly with the promise of better treatment. Thanks to these efforts, the team managed to stabilize the submarine. With the immediate threat to the vessel under control, Lieutenant David's team turned their focus to the intelligence on board. They moved cautiously, aware that traps might be waiting. Deep within the U-boat, they found what they were looking for: the Enigma machine, still intact. Alongside it were codebooks and navigation charts. These were carefully removed and prepared for transport. As the boarding party emerged with their haul, they became the first American sailors to board and secure an active German U-boat. The successful capture of U-505 was a historic feat, but the mission was far from over. The next challenge was towing the heavily damaged submarine to safety, something that had never been attempted. The U-boat was still partially flooded, and its hull was compromised. The Americans chose Bermuda, 1,700 nautical miles away, as the destination. It was distant enough to avoid German detection, and had the resources needed to keep the operation secret. USS Pillsbury began the towing operation by attaching a line to U-505, but it soon became clear that the damaged rudder made the submarine difficult to control. The U-boat veered wildly, colliding with Pillsbury multiple times, and damaging the destroyer below the waterline. Captain Gallery quickly changed tactics and ordered the flagship USS Guadalcanal to take over. This was an unconventional choice. Escort carriers weren't built for towing, but Guadalcanal's power and equipment made her the best option. A new tow line was secured between the carrier and U-505, and the journey resumed. Thanks to the earlier stabilization efforts, the submarine's propellers were still spinning, generating power and recharging the batteries. With electricity restored, the Americans could keep some of U-505's systems functional and maintain control during the voyage. With all 59 surviving crew members aboard the Guadalcanal including Captain Gallery, decided to visit the wounded German commander in the sick bay. Longa was unaware of the full outcome of the battle. Gallery introduced himself and told him plainly that they had his submarine in tow. Langer blinked, then looked stunned, skeptical of the claim. To prove it, Gallery showed him family photographs recovered from the submarine. Realizing the truth, Lange sighed and admitted that he would likely be punished for what had happened. As U-505 and her crew headed to Bermuda, USS Jenks sped ahead with the Enigma machine and 10 sacks of codebooks and documents, totaling over 1,500 pages. Back in Washington, however, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King was furious. He feared that news of the capture would reach the Germans, causing them to change their Enigma codes and compromising Allied intelligence. He scolded Gallery harshly and even threatened him with a court-martial. But the Germans never found out what had happened. Gallery enforced strict silence among the task group. Astonishingly, every crew member complied with the silence order. Timing worked in their favor. Just 2 days after the capture of U-505, the Allies landed in Normandy. This historic event drew global attention and effectively overshadowed any German attempts to investigate the disappearance of the submarine. In Berlin, U-505 was officially declared lost. As days passed, the task force remained on high alert, constantly wary of a potential German counterattack as they towed the captured vessel across the Atlantic. Finally, on June 19, 1944, Task Group 22.3 arrived safely in the harbor at Bermuda. With this achievement, Captain Daniel Gallery became the first U.S. Navy officer in over a century to capture an enemy warship at sea. As U-505 entered port, she flew a large American flag above a smaller German naval ensign on her flagstaffer, striking symbol of her changed fate. After the 59 German prisoners were handed over to the base commandant and confined in an isolated camp to maintain absolute secrecy, the U.S. Navy moved U-505 to the naval operating base in Bermuda. There, intelligence officers and engineers examined every inch of the captured submarine. To further preserve the secrecy of the operation, the Navy repainted the vessel to resemble an American ship and gave it the cover name USS Nemo. This disguise was essential to supporting the illusion that U-505 had been destroyed. As the Germans still believed, what had begun as a bold and risky gamble had turned into an extraordinary triumph. Gallery's decision to capture U-505 intact provided Allied codebreakers with the tools they needed to decode U-boat signals in real time. This advantage allowed the Allies to use the Kriegsmarine's own communication systems against them, dealing a serious blow to Admiral Denitz's submarine fleet during the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Royal E. Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, praised the accomplishment, calling it an outstanding performance during anti-submarine operations and an unprecedented act of bravery and execution in the history of the U.S. Navy. For his leadership, Lieutenant Albert David, who led the boarding party aboard U-505, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the only Atlantic Fleet sailor to receive the medal during the war. The entire task group also received the Presidential Unit Citation in recognition of their extraordinary efforts. No figure emerged more celebrated from the mission than Captain Daniel V. Gallery. His vision and bold leadership earned the admiration of his peers and the American public. The operation launched his career forward, and he was soon given command of the USS Hancock, a powerful Essex-class fleet carrier that would serve in the Pacific. By the war's end, he had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral. Beyond his wartime achievements, Gallery became a prolific author, capturing his experiences and reflections in several books. In his most well-known work, 20 Million Tons Under the Sea *, he recounted the dramatic and unlikely story of U-505's capture. Throughout, he remained modest, giving little credit to himself and emphasizing the importance of preparation. Reflecting on the mission's success, he once remarked that maybe their daily morning prayers had something to do with it.